to be with you. This series is sort of extended throughout the summer as we've been living with the prodigal son and that whole narrative. And I feel like it's fitting for, I think, all of us in this space. I know it has been for me in terms of just my own experiences in my own life. And if I can, I would like to take you down a little bit of a journey this morning. It's a little personal. It's my own markings. And in a sense, I could look at my life over the past 7 or 8 seasons of it, and maybe the last, 30 or 40 years of it, and say, there's these 7 or 8 chunks, these times, these key moments when shifts happened for me, sometimes intellectual, sometimes experiential, sometimes maybe something interior. And this summer, I felt like, in a sense, this series marked one of those shifts for me. And so, most of you are familiar with this prodigal son story. If you've been here a couple times this summer, you've heard us read the thing in its entirety, and I will not do that, but I just want to start out kind of summarizing it. So Luke 15, Jesus tells this story. It's not a true story. He tells this parable. It's a story. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my shares of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. And so if you know the rest of the story, you know the son goes off, spends all his resources, finds himself in a place where he's got nothing, and realizes, maybe living with my father, maybe he would take me back as a servant. That would be better than my current context. So he goes back home, and if you know the story, you know that the dad goes running towards the son, welcomes his young son back home. He's grateful, he's thrilled. And again, the imagery and the metaphor is just beautiful. It's loaded with stuff. We've spent the entire summer talking about that. Of course, you might know the rest of the story, that the older brother who's been faithful, who's stayed around, who hasn't gone anywhere, he's been the prolific one in the family to keep things up and going. He's frustrated that his dad is honoring the younger son after he pillaged everything, his portion of the estate, and now has the audacity to come back home. And the older son is frustrated, and the father says, "But son, you don't understand, your brother is alive, he's home, he's returned. Isn't this something to celebrate?" And the older son is frustrated. And the story ends with that tension. There's beauty of the return, and yet there's the frustration and tension of the older son. And when I look at this story across the board, it's deeply moving, because every one of us in this space can resonate with one of those positions. The older son, who's maybe faithful, who's always sort of there, he's reliable, he's predictable, and everybody else seems to be living off of your hard work and your energy. Or maybe you're the younger son who, I don't know, was crazy and wild, and for whatever reason you wanted to come back home and somebody welcomed you home. Or maybe you're the father, you're that person who said, "You know what, arms open, you come back, you're always welcome." Whatever role it might be, you look at this story and you might say, it inspires me because it fits for my reality. Is the story factual? No. Is the story nonetheless still powerful? Yes. Did it happen? No. Is it happening? Yes. This summer, I had, again, for me, in this narrative, in this story, I had this shift, and it was significant for me. And again, this series played this huge piece of it. And what I've come to understand about my own journey, my own experience, and I think this is illustrative of most of you, that we have this narrative that is us. We have this story that is us. We have this idea of meaning that somehow has been informed by our upbringing, by our experiences, by our adulthood, by our relationships or lack thereof. And no matter what seemingly happens, we kind of find ourselves in this ever-evolving trajectory of narrative. We have our own story that is kind of inside of us here. And then we have this other story that is out here. Maybe it's the story of when you were growing up and you went to your religious experience and you were told that story. Maybe it was a story of you should be an athlete so you're involved in sports. Or maybe it's a story of you should be an academic, or you should be smart, you should go off to school, or you should be, and whatever it is, that this other story that was around you, or other multiple stories, you found yourself latching onto that narrative. It's what we do. We look for other stories and we hook into them. Fundamentally, religiosity is about narrative. It's about story. It's how we put context to the unknown. We create images, we create stories, we create ideas that give us metaphors so that we can try to grab at this idea of God and what does that begin to look like. And that's why stories are so profound. So for all of us, we have this ever-evolving trajectory, or at least I think it's the context for most of you in this space. So what I've come to conclude is this, that we all have these different layers, these different stages that we go through in terms of how we take our story and how we associate it with the stories around us. I think this is very important to understand, especially for those of us who have grown up in religious contexts. So I was the kid who was born some random day of the week, and on Sunday morning, I was there in the nursery. And then I think we had Sunday night services, and I was there in the nursery that night. And then we had Wednesday night services, and I was there in the nursery those nights. And the church culture was a part of my upbringing. And I think for many of you, that's been part of your narrative. Every once in a while, I'll bump into somebody here who has zero religious expression. And in one sense, you are probably ahead of all of us, right? You aren't as tainted. You aren't as marked. You come into a space a little bit more pure, to be honest. But for most of us, we have our narrative, we have our story, and we've hooked into it in terms of the religious expressions that we connected with. I remember in third grade, my now 94-year-old grandmother for decades taught third grade Sunday school class. I would go to Sunday school class, and there was Grandma Hofert. Fifth grade, Uncle Carl, my father's uncle, taught fifth grade boys Sunday school class. And these were people in my life. These were family that I saw at holidays and Monday night dinners. And these were people that talked about these ideas of God and these stories of the Bible. And there was a sense of truth to this. Not only were the stories profound, but these were adults that, of course, were going to communicate good story, good narrative towards me. And what it did as a young child is it created a little bit of a tribal identity, because we could kind of circle the wagons around these different Bible stories that we heard growing up. And they were interesting, they were insightful, some of them were funny, some of them were intense. You had David and Goliath, and you had all these big dramatic, you had people walking around walls of cities and cities come crashing in. All these were very interesting stories and dramatic stories that we as kids took and bought hook, line, and sinker. Completely true. And we identified our little third grade or our little fourth grade or our little fifth grade minds to those stories. That's what we do. It's how we operate. It's how we see things. But then there would be a few people, and I think this is probably many of you. You're this rogue person that says, well, I hear that story, but did it really happen that way? Wait, I got a couple questions. Is that really true? Or is there a part of that story that might just be true? And it moved into this second stage for many of us. Not a lot of people, but a few of you. And I think most of you here at Watershed, this was the beginning of your journey, the beginning of your reality. You begin to question some of the stories that you were associating with as a child. And again, some of those stories might not have been anything to do with the church, but for many of us, we were marked by these stories, and then we began to push against them ever so gently, and invariably, the proverbial teacher in your Sunday school class, or your Jewish expression, or your Hindu expression, or your Buddhist philosophical, whatever the context you might have found yourself gaining some energy, and you began to push back ever so gently about it and ask questions. And invariably, people who never made it past stage one and they're still adults are saying, oh, no, this is the way it is and you have to hold to it. You can't edit it. You can't tweak it. This is truth, and any editing from that would sort of discredit the whole experience and would come crashing down. You began to realize that maybe some of the things that you've heard, the stories that you've associated with your own narrative, aren't completely true in terms of happening like maybe you were taught they happen. And so what began to happen internally, and most of us, this happened later in life. This didn't happen when we were kids. This happened later in life. You begin to sort of say, well, wait a minute, I've associated with that story, with that narrative, and if it's not completely accurate, then you begin to realize that the underpinnings become loosened somewhat, and you're not sure anymore who you are or who you're becoming, because the things that you've attached to aren't as stable as they used to be. And then you begin to continue the question asking, and you move into really this third stage where large portions of the stories, they become these sort of myths or metaphors. That you begin asking yourself some really good questions that, is it possible that we've talked about this here, that the creation story, 6 literal days, and then the seventh day, God pulled up the proverbial lazy boy and sat back and chilled for a day. Did that literally happen that way? Was the earth created in somehow 24-hour chunks over 6 days with this sense of literalism, of which, for the record, I was taught, and many of us were taught? And those are stories that we associated our own story onto. But what begins to happen when science begins to break that down a little bit? What begins to happen when you actually look at the Bible from a literary standpoint, and you begin to realize that the creation story is not a narrative. It's actually written in poem form. Now, I'm not a poetic person by any stretch of the imagination, and I don't necessarily read as much poetry as I probably should read, but what I've come to understand about poetry is, by definition, is loaded with metaphor, loaded with trying to communicate a more beautiful idea just by sort of being liberal with the language. So if the creation story is actually a poem, then maybe we can see it in terms of that the essence of the universe created all that is in this chunk of time. Whatever the time was, is sort of irrelevant, but at the end of it, there was a sense of rest. And so when we create, it's okay to slow down and rest. Like maybe there's other parts of that story that we're actually supposed to associate with. And you find yourself realizing that these myths and these metaphors begin to sort of unravel everything that you've held to, because they no longer become the truths. Those stories become a little bit crumbled, and you begin to realize, I'm not sure who I am anymore. Now, we've been identified here at Watershed. People tell us this. We are told by you, because many of you Google these two words, progressive church. And for whatever reason, in Charlotte, we come to the top of that list, which I am thrilled about, for the record. We come to the top of that list. The problem with and first of all, progressive is a little bit of a cocky statement, somehow that we've arrived, right? And that is not us. We've by no means arrived. Hopefully we're on this ongoing movement, so I'll take that side of progressive. But I think the progressive church is missing it in huge ways. Because what we've done in the progressive expression is we have sort of, we've taken the stories that we once would have said in the traditional context that are 100% true, and in the progressive space we said, oh, they're myth and metaphor. And what we've done is we've moved into this fourth stage where most of the traditions that we've held to somehow are no longer credible, because we don't have these stories that we think are true anymore. And because the story is not true, therefore we throw kind of everything out with the baby with the bathwater. And what begins to happen is my story was wrapped up in all those sort of true that then became more mythical stories. And now that I don't hold on to those anymore, what is it I can hold on to? What is it I can cling to? We find for many of you, this is the problem that you've kind of bumped into. I have this conversation probably weekly. I got an email from some folks who are moving potentially to Charlotte this past weekend from the West Coast. And they emailed me, they're in their 60s, and they're struggling with all these different things they grew up with in the church. I mean, they're at like the stage 3 and 4 place where they've held on to all these beliefs for all these years, and now they're realizing that maybe those beliefs aren't actually as accurate or as solid as they thought they were. That those stories and those narratives were not as true as they were before, and so they're seeing them as more metaphor, and they're toying with throwing everything out. They're toying with sort of walking away from the whole deal. But the church for them has been significant. The church for many of you has been significant. And for so many of you, you feel like walking away from it at times, because intellectually, the dance of what is true, what is not true, it's begun to crumble the foundation that you've held to. But there's this interior thing that says, I'm not ready to walk away from it yet. That maybe there's actually something out there worth sinking our teeth into. Maybe those people at Watershed are trying to figure out what that begins to look like, what that begins to feel like. I have this conversation maybe 3 or 4 times a month. Invariably, I'll meet you afterwards. Maybe you'll come to the last call at the back, or I'll meet you as you walk in. Hi, my name's Scott. What's your name? My name's Fred or Sue or whatever their name is. You tell me your name. And we have a couple conversations. And one of the things I'm always intrigued with was, how did you hear about Watershed? And invariably, you'll say, well, my neighbor, Tony, they were telling me about this community, and I really should be a part of this community because of the things that I'm kind of going through in my life. Oh, awesome. Who's Tony? Tony, whatever. Oh, he doesn't go here, but he told me you need to be here. Like, I hear that all the time. And somehow there's this persona out there that, like, we're dancing, we're playing with things. But sometimes, again, I think the dark side of the progressive narrative is that we're dancing with things that we no longer really hold to anymore. And because we don't hold these stories to be 100% true, somehow the validity of those stories goes away, and now we're just trying to sort of grab at straws, but we don't want to let it all go yet. And that is about that's like the distance that most of the progressive expression has gone. There's a word that has been overused in the church these days. and it's called the idea of deconstruction, where you've had all these foundations that you constructed as a child or that were constructed for you, and you've questioned so many things that you've deconstructed everything. It's all starting to kind of crumble down, and you have nothing to hold on to. And we're here to say we are not about the narrative of deconstruction, all that's going to happen, and we invite you into that journey, and most of us have been through it. We are more about the narrative of reconstruction. So what does it mean to re-engage a new narrative? What does it mean to re-engage a new story? Because what you begin to find, I think we're playing with this here, and this has been kind of my aha awakening this summer, is that we are beginning to realize the value of story, the value of narrative, whether it be true or mythical, is still very important, still very inspiring. It matters that you have a story to sink your lives to. I mean, someday it's possible my sons might say to me, Dad, I'm not sure if Noah really built an ark and animals showed up in pairs to that ark on their own. I mean, I got a dog that I can't keep, it's like herding cats. I can't keep him controlled, let alone him showing up in an ark somewhere across the world. The idea that somehow all these animals showed up, and that's what the story says. And someday they might come to me and they say, Dad, I'm not sure it's 100% true. In my past context at stage 1, as an adult at stage 1, I would have had to say, oh, no. Let me prove to you why that is true. And I'm sort of hunkering down, holding them to that place where they're wanting to sort of evolve to another space and ask really better questions than, was the story true or is the story inspiring? Is the idea that God created all that is and said, I'm going to create this story. There's a story out there that God takes care of his creation. That he loves his creation so much so that he's going to make sure that they're taken care of, that his humankind and his creatures, that there's another narrative being played out in that space. And so they're going to come to me one day and say, Dad, I'm not sure I hold to that as like a true story. And I'm like, well, that's okay. Because hopefully we're able to say, well, you know what? But there's a story, there's a narrative, whether it be true or mythical, is worthy of holding on to because the story inspires. It synchronizes our identity because the stories that are out here and your own narrative, it's important that they overlap. It's important that we connect with these other stories that are going on. And it moves us into the 6th stage, that we are all looking for meaning in story that really informs and helps us, that marks us. That it's something we all want to associate with, that we all want to connect with. And again, I think the dark side of the progressive church, and again, it's so funny, that's a technical category. The dark side of the progressive church, which we have been told we are, we don't necessarily self-identify, but we've been told we are, is we get so technical with the narrative that we believe it not to exist anymore, and it's not true that we throw the whole thing out. But I'm here to say that, did Noah's Ark really happen? I'm not sure, but I can tell you it's happening. Did David and Goliath happen? Did really the little scrawny dude beat up some bigger dude with a rock in the middle of his forehead and then go chop his head off? Did that really happen? I don't know if it really happened, but I know it's happening. That the underdog has a voice. Is that not the more beautiful story? Is that not the more beautiful narrative? And let me jump ahead from when that story would have happened, maybe 1,000 years or so, and possibly Jesus would have invited us into a more elegant narrative, a more elegant story that is way harder than hitting the dude in the head and killing him, chopping his head off. It's, wait a minute, slow everything down. Actually, you're invited to love him. That's a narrative. That's an identity that many of us these days do not identify with, that we struggle to identify with. We want to sort of plow through things, and we want the David and Goliath story to be true because that actually is a really redemptive story. But Jesus is saying, actually, I've got a more redemptive way to live. It's to love not only yourself, but the people around you. And you know what? Even the people that are out to get you. What does it mean for us to identify with those kinds of stories? What does it mean for us to inform our children in Greenhouse that that's the kind of narrative we're inviting them into? Is that not inspiring? Does that not draw us? Does that not move us? In one sense, what we've done is we've come full circle. Right? As kids, we're in the proverbial Sunday school class, and we buy everything, hook, line, and sinker, and then we begin to ask questions, and we begin to sort of almost walk away from it because it's no longer of any consequence or value. It's not true, so what does it mean? Who cares? It's just a bunch of myth. Actually, the story can be compelling. The story can be motivating. The story can be charging of who we are. And that's true of the prodigal son as well. That when we listen to the story, and we know by definition, Jesus says it wasn't true, that it inspires us, it moves us, it compels us, it challenges us, it pushes us in places that we've never been before. Did the prodigal son happen? No, but it's happening. Did Jesus resurrect from the dead? I don't know for sure. I can't prove that. But what I do know is that resurrection is happening. I know that people are experiencing death, and in that death, they find new life. A good friend of mine, if I can find it, here it is. This is my good friend. He gave me this chip. It represents his 3rd year of sobriety. He gave me maybe, 5-6 weeks ago. Last year, he gave me his 2-year chip. He didn't know I was even going to talk about him this morning, but I talked to him in the back here literally during the first song set, and he went on and on about this community. He's in a small group here. He's one of our blocks. And he said this community, in one sense, has saved him. I said, how's your week going? He said, it's been one of the hardest years of my life, but I've realized that. He said these words to me. He goes, I'm not sure what I mean by this, because I'm almost glad I had to deal with my alcoholism, and that I became an alcoholic so that I found this community. And what he was saying in that, he says, death brought life. So did resurrection happen? Literally? I don't know. But it is a profound story. It's a profound narrative that death brings life. It's a reality that we all live with. It's a reality that we all contend with. It's the kind of story that we want to identify with, right? I mean, here we are over here trying to figure out who are we? Who are we becoming? And we are informed by these stories and by these experiences and by the community and the space. And isn't that the story we want to self-identify with? That who we are becoming is, we're experiencing little mini deaths all the time. Loss and difficulty and pain and hurt. But in those deaths, we find resurrection. We find life. What I've come to understand is that the prodigal story for us is profound because it helps us self-identify with different contexts and different stories. I was at Pride last week. So Kindred is one of our blocks here. It's our LGBTQ community. And I think this is our 3rd or 4th year, I can't remember, that we have a booth at Pride. And can I say how proud and grateful for the most gracious part of our community here in our LGBT community who's representing us so well in the streets of Pride, the Pride Festival and the events. And then for us to join them in that experience. And so I went up there last Saturday afternoon because we have this booth up there, and many of you signed up to be there, and we were just greeting people and welcoming people, and they were doing selfies with the stand-up Jesus character and all these kind of random things. And I said, all right, guys, there's a ton of people. I'm just gonna walk down Tryon. You can't take it all in, right? If you've ever been there, there's so much. I mean, there's people in khaki shorts and white t-shirts, like myself, and there's people with glittered beards on. Like, so the whole variance of difference is awesome. I'm walking down the center of Tryon, and just taking it in, because there was a day I was the person in stage 1 who was critical of that space. I'm walking down the middle of this road, and I don't know how else to define it except it was palpable. There was no criticism in the space. There was no sense of judgment. Everybody was welcome to be who they are. Whether you agree with whatever's going on in that reality, there was a sense that I am free in this space. Because since humankind's inception, the oppression of our LGBTQ friends and family has been a reality, and here is a sense of just complete openness. And I'm walking down the road, and there was a sense of, oh, this is good. There's something beautiful and elegant about this. And off to the side is this dude with a long pole, and on top of it are a bunch of verses, and words like evil and hate and sin, and verse and passages, and he had a shirt on that had those passages on it. And that was tragic in and of itself, because there was a day I was a little bit more in that camp with that group, embarrassingly so. And behind him was I assumed it was his wife, and she was holding a little baby, and had this kind of classic, and like a little doily on the head, and a long denim skirt, and she too had a sign and was sort of screaming out stuff. And that was tragic, but maybe the greatest tragedy was behind them were 3 children. Two of the 3 kids looked about my boy's age. And they too had signs and t-shirts. And you could tell these kids didn't want to be there. It went against everything against everything of who they are to somehow scream out to people. Like their story was not aligning right, but they didn't know any differently because Dad said to do this and probably talked them into it and created a jacked up narrative that I guarantee you, I promise, those kids will not be in that same space in the next 10, 15, 20 years, right? God only knows what will be going on, and I hope they experience freedom. I hope they're able to push through some of that. But I looked at that space and I said, these kids are experiencing a tragic narrative that is not welcoming, that is not kind, that is not Jesus-centric at any level. And so who are they becoming? My hope here at Watershed is that you and I are continuing to jump into story, into narrative, into experiences that are ebbing and flowing. And sure, we can ask the question about historicity, and are they accurate, and are they true, did they ever happen? And that's fine, that's all good. But I'm not sure the most compelling part of our tradition is did it actually happen as much as it's happening. So Colson, my oldest son, who's now 14, for years, Billy Strickland, one of our founding people of Watershed, he gave Colson, when I think it was 3 or 4, a big, thick, hardbound comic book series. I didn't grow up on comic books. I run around in leotards. I don't know. It wasn't my thing. So he had this book, and he was at that place just starting to read, and he was devouring. I mean, in one sense, he learned to read with this book. And every night for maybe a year and a half or 2, I read him a piece of this comic book. And we went through the thing 50 times. And so a few years later, he had all these costumes, like kids do, right? They have all the costumes and superhero costumes. I mean, he was jumping off ledges, trying to fly at 4 and 5, and landing on his face, and couldn't understand why he couldn't fly. The whole deal. And so he was around 7 or 8. He had this little Batman costume from head to toe, the ears, the boots, the yellow belt, the cape, the whole deal. And Billy said, "Hey, Scott, have you taken your son to Comic-Con uptown yet?" I was like, well, no. I mean, I'm not into that. I'm not into comic books, and so I had no idea what it was. I figured it'd be a big comic book convention, but it's way more than that for those of you who haven't been there. So at 7 years of age, I take Colson to Comic-Con. He loved it. And these were grown-ass men wearing Batman costumes and women with, it was they looked like real people that were those people that we watch, in the comic book. And they were wanting pictures with Colson. They were kneeling down because he looked authentic, and of course they looked authentic, and Darth Vader, and all these people were there. And I could think, I don't understand. I don't get it. What is going on here? And we did that for 5 or 6 years. I think Billy just torched me. Hey, Scott, it's Comic-Con again this year, and we go, and all these people and all this stuff. And Colson loved it, but here's what I've come to realize. I'm slow to the game. We all want to identify with a redemptive narrative. Comic-Con is a bunch of people who win in the end, right? Overall. It's the bad guy loses because the superhero prevails. And it's a story we want to identify with. And do you think that those people at Comic-Con think it really happened? I think there's some that do. I really do. I think there's some that actually thought they were Darth Vader, but we all know there's the few. But do most people think that stuff happened? No. Why do they associate with it? Because it's redemptive. Does every nuance of our experience and our tradition have to somehow be perfect and fit? No. Why? Because we can associate with a redemptive narrative that says, resurrection and death, those are beautiful realities because they happen every day. The stories of the Old Testament, the creation and floods and the good guy winning and David and Goliath, are those true stories? I don't know. But can they inspire and inform our current context? Yes. Can you identify with those? Yes. So here at Watershed, it's not just about deconstructing and tearing things apart and throwing them out. No, it's about reconstruction. It's about saying that actually, in a very real way for me this year, the stories of the Bible have come alive. The stories of the Bible are, for different reasons, more valuable and more profound to my identity. The stories of other faith models out there are inspiring. Your story is inspiring, and it might be so inspiring that I want to identify with that. So I'm going to do my best to associate with you and connect with you because I'm a better person, because our stories begin to overlap. So what I've come to realize here at Watershed is we are a room full of different narratives. And for most of you, you've moved past those first couple stages where you're realizing what your narrative can be inspiring to me. Whether it's fully true or accurate or not, that sort of doesn't matter. That it's something that moves me. I want to identify with it. I want to be inspired and compelled to become this different person. So when we start using words like gospel or transformation or change or living the ways of Jesus, they are inspiring realities that take us into our Monday differently than how we maybe have lived the previous week. So God, we are so grateful that we get to live in the flexibility of this tribe, of this community, who take you so seriously. Yet they don't maybe always take themselves quite as seriously. There's a sense of, I'm still learning, I'm still discovering, I'm still trying to figure out who I am. Thank you that here in the next moments ahead, we get to spend time hanging out and socializing and connecting and sharing stories and sharing narrative. Because in that space, in those stories, we might find hope. We might find a sense of waking up. So God, when we say we love you and we love each other, like there's connection, there's stories that help us identify in more profound ways under that space, under that context. Thanks for allowing us to be together today. We love you. Amen.